This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jay Coakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Hello, welcome again to the Sports and Society podcast. Hey, Jay.
Hey, Jeff. It's good to be here. Good to be here with our guest today.
Yeah, we're really excited because this episode is going to focus on sports and imperialism. People reading Sports and Society or have followed this podcast know Jay and I will always contest the idea that sports are an apolitical escape from the seriousness of everyday life. And our guest, Dr. Chen Chen, will help us contest that idea once again. In fact, we are arguing today that sports are tied to war, oppression, and death. But if sports are apolitical, as we argue, then they are also a site of resistance against oppression and exploitation, which is central to Chen's work. This episode directly addresses Chapter 13 on sports and politics, Chapter 11 on sports and the economy, but also Chapter 8 on sports and race, and Chapter 6 on violence and abuse. Our guest today is one of the world's leading scholars on sports and imperialism, as well as an important anti-imperialist activist. Dr. Chen Chen is an assistant professor of sport management at the University of Connecticut. Chen describes himself as a grateful visitor to the land known as Connecticut, originated from the Algonquin word Connecticut, which means besides the long tidal river. Chen takes an interdisciplinary approach to examine the paradoxical role of sport as a tool of both oppression and resistance within the structures of capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism. Chen is a staunch advocate for working-class students, scholars, and other underrepresented backgrounds. He is a founding member of Sports Scholars for Justice in Palestine and currently serves as a member of the executive committee for the American Association of University Professors, UConn chapter. Welcome to the podcast, Chen.
Happy to be here. Honored to be here talking with the two of you, two sort of trailblazer in the field of sports sociology.
Thanks, Chen. I think that applies for Jay far more than it applies for myself, but I'll accept the honor as well. Okay, so let's jump in. We ask everybody a couple of questions to get started. So, Chen, can you tell us a little bit about your sporting biography?
Yeah, absolutely. I imagine that my sort of experience would differ a little bit from other guests that you have. I grew up in the 90s and early 2000s in China. So a lot of my experience playing sport were pickup basketball, soccer after school, and never play anywhere in terms of competitive sport at a high level. But I was a huge fan of watching sport as a kid growing up. And like I said, in the 90s and early 2000s, my father, my grandfather would sit me down. We watched together European soccer leagues, weekend nights, NBA games. When Yao Ming, a lot of people came to the United States and played the Houston Rockets in the early 2000s, and that was a huge following in China. And of course, I think the significant sort of moment for me was also 1998, the men's soccer World Cup in France, and 2000 Summer Olympics in Sydney. And those were some of the occasions where I got to be fascinated with the power of sport in, quote unquote, bringing communities together, even a nation together. So when I went to college in China, I studied journalism and I wanted to be a sport journalist. I wrote for the school newspaper's sports section for 4 years. And I was fascinated with how sport interact and intersects with societal affairs, uh, culture, history, geography, which led me to my doctoral studies at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. So at the time, I had an aspirational view of sport in Western countries, and that led me to, of course, try to study in an institution in a country like Canada. But I would say that that more aspirational view got transformed as I lived in Canada, as I sort of learned more about the colonial history of Canada and the Indigenous people's struggle against ongoing settler colonialism. And I would say another significant moment was when I was working as a volunteer in 2017, the year of Canada 150 to this year, America 250. That was Canada 150. I volunteer at an event called the World Indigenous Nations Games in Treaty 6 territory. In fact, I'm still wearing a hat from that game today. And when I say that those experiences were transformational, I meant that working around Indigenous folks at a sport event that was designed and operated according to Indigenous worldviews gave me an understanding of how Indigenous people use sport as a means of resistance and assertion of their identity, in their sovereignty, and a way of self-determination. It also disrupts in my mind the sort of mainstream notion of sport as competition. Rather, for Indigenous folks, they view sport, at least the ones that I interact and talk with and learn from, as a way of sustainable, reciprocal way of life in the context of human and non-human species. So that propels me, of course, to reflect on my own trajectory of being a sports fan, being a sport a student and scholar, and sort of disrupt my sort of understanding of what sports should be, and what kind of benefits should sport bring to different people and communities. So also sort of propelled me to ask a question to myself: what am I doing here? What is my responsibility as a scholar who studies sport? So that will sort of give folks an understanding of how I came to be here.
I love that. That's a great story. So, what specifically do you think when you think about the bonding with your family? Very familiar to me, right? I oftentimes joke that if it wasn't for gardening, my dad and I wouldn't have had anything to talk about in the off season. That sport was such a part of our bonding. It was such a part of his relationship to my sons. But then you have this experience as a journalist, and then you come to Canada and you engage with the Indigenous games. Where where exactly did you see a kind of both disjuncture but also continuity that propels you into the work you're doing now?
Yeah, I would say that's a great dialectical way of framing this, and I would say that the sort of understanding of Western capitalist commercial sport. Of course, the more I understand the inner workings, the background, the political economy of it, the sort of initial fervor or aspiration inevitably recedes. But to your point, Jeff, I would say that understanding and learning about how physical culture, sport serve as a community bonding a mechanism for Indigenous people, despite the hundreds, if not decades, of effort from the settler state to deprive them of their identity and ways of life. I think it sort of still affirms the importance of of practicing sport, of using sport as a positive force. So I'm it's hard for me to pinpoint a exact moment, but I will say that this is an ongoing process of reflection that I imagine that all of us are going through at any given time.
Oh, 100%. And I think it hits some people more strongly than others. Clearly, powerfully hit you because the intensity and the passion that you bring to the work you do now is incredible. And I want to pick up on one of the things that you just mentioned, which was the commercialized model of sport that we see in Canada, the United States, and other we'll call them imperialist nations. Um, that you're doing this critique of that. Your background's in sport management, your doctoral degree, I should say, is in sport management. You work in a sport management department. Historically, sport management, particularly in North America, has been very pro-business. And that it's really like, emphasize that we need to support practitioners, meaning the people that run sports in a commercial model. And I just want to take one line from your bio. Chen takes an interdisciplinary approach to examine the paradoxical role of sport as a tool of both oppression and resistance within the structures of capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism, which I love. That doesn't strike me as the typical sport management profile. Can you talk about that? Doing this kind of work within sport management? Why sport management? Let's start there. Like, why sport management? You could be in a sociology department. You could be in ethnic studies department. There's a lot of other programs that traditionally I would see a scholar like you in, not traditionally sport management. So can you talk about like why sport management and then what are the tensions that you need to negotiate within sport management? And I'm just thinking this could be really useful for a similarly minded student who is in sport management.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I will start with saying that as a young person of in their early 20s, I look up what kind of programs I could get into to study sport, and then I recognize that the majority of, if not most of them, are sport management. Sport management is everywhere. In fact, in the US alone, there are 400 plus sport management academic programs in universities and colleges. I can't say that the same thing about sports sociology. So, so that of course.
Oh man, that hurts.
So how I got into sport management, I got into a kinesiology program working with a faculty member whose work is in sport management. So of course I didn't know what it was and until I was in it. So it's sort of like I serendipitously just got moved into the field. And now looking back and now looking across the landscape, like I said earlier, that's where the most sort of like academic program resources, faculty members, students are at. Honestly speaking, I wouldn't mind being in a ethnic studies, sociology program, and there is also that dynamic where whether a sports scholar who studies sport from a sociological perspective would be similarly valued over there, because as we all know that studying sport is regarded as a trivial endeavor in some corners of our institutions. But get back to sport management. Now I've been in sport management for over a decade, and as a faculty member for 5 years, I recognize that it is the field that seems to have the most legitimacy within academia, within higher education, especially in countries like US, Canada, Australia, UK, so on and so forth, like you said, the most overdeveloped countries. And so I would say that looking across the institutions, we also realize that sport management are pulling in students, are supplying tuition dollars to the university. And so going back to the importance of the analysis of political economy, now we understand why a pro-business sort of field of inquiry would gain its foothold in university. And in terms of my experience, from a teaching standpoint, I like it. Like you said, Jeff, earlier, that's where you get to meet and interact with a greater number of students who aspire to be the workforce in the sport industry. I want to be a GM. I want to be a GM one day. And so I would say that these are the folks I get to interact on a daily basis as a teacher, as an instructor. And I came to recognize that not, of course, I'm in a public university. Not all the students come to my classroom are from necessarily well-off background. Most of them are working class, middle class families, from middle class families, working class families. And I also like that because the sport industry provides us with endless materials to, to tap into, to sort of shape and transform their understanding from a rosy view of the sport industry to a more critical understanding. One example is internship. One example is sort of the exploited process of doing work for sport industry, including the teams on campus, the very same team that draw them to be here. So I would say that tapping into those opportunities, tapping into those tension moments, because students will come to me or, say in the classroom, I work 40 hours on top of, my 5 classes workload for this football team. I do the laundries the entire week. And I have to miss classes. I have to miss my sleep. And when I talk about exploitation, when I talk about labor, a dynamic within the sport industry, that will, just land on them firmly. So,
Yeah, and what you're talking about, Chen, certainly transcends Canada and the U.S. and the other countries you mentioned. And that raises an issue that oftentimes we don't talk about, even in the sociology of sport and certainly in sport management. And that is how, in terms of global sports and the history of global sports, when did sport become a part or become attached to or integrated with imperialism and colonialism? And I know you can't go into all of the history here, but just on a conceptual level, why was sport brought into the whole process of imperialism and colonialism?
for sure, I would do my best to be brief here. If we consider the emergence of modern organized commercial sport, we recognize that it first appeared in the urban areas of London, Britain, in the 17th, 18th century, and with the population that increasingly started to have some disposable income, they can spend on watching, boxing fights, so on and so forth. So we have to ask the question of why sport, modern organized commercial sport, first appeared there. My answer, based on sport history literature, is that It is not possible without British colonialism that transferred wealth from its colonies to the center or metropolitan area of London. So that itself tells us that the birth of modern sport is a result of imperialism and colonialism. And then we take a look at the structure of then British and French Empire. Still, Spain and Portugal had their colonies. We start to look at how different colonial nations used sport, of course, in different ways. There were officials, but there were also just business people, export forms of sport, football, soccer or cricket, so on and so forth, to the colonies. And in different locations, sport was utilized as a tool of discipline the local population to instill within them the idea of being a modern person, be an industrial-minded person. You have to have self-discipline, so on and so forth. Give up your sort of previous identity, so on and so forth. We see that happening in a lot of still settler colonial state nowadays. And then when we take a look at the emergence of the international sport governing bodies that we see today, IOC, FIFA, we have to recognize that the earlier sort of folks that form the organizations were European aristocrats themselves, and it was mostly confined to a few European and later on United States nations. And they reluctantly allowed membership to the newly independent African and Asian countries in the mid-20th centuries after people in those areas have fought bravely and gained political independence. So I would say those are some of the earlier ways that we can take a look at modern sport that we see as phenomenon today is embedded within imperialism. And of course, we can go further and take a look at today's mega events. For example, we take a look at how the sort of technologies that, for example, U.S. military that is deploying overseas to fight quote unquote terrorists are often, brought back to police the local population, even in countries like the UK and United States. We can also take a look at why, the flow of bodies, like you mentioned earlier, Jay, the flow of bodies of athletic labor from global South to the global North. One example I always like to use is Dominican baseball players to the MLB, where a major corporation like MLB set up academies down in Dominican Republic, exploiting the economic underdevelopment down there, and use a mechanism to gain cheap athletic talent so that they can gain some competitive advantage back home. And we can also take a look at the global commodity chain nowadays. For example, the manufacturing of sporting goods, such as sneakers and so on and so forth. One example I always use is Nike. We take a look at why Nike started to outsource its production to overseas, to Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. That's because it is cheaper to find labor to produce the sneakers and the jerseys and shirts, so on and so forth, so that the corporation headquartered in a country like the United States can keep raking in profit and hold up its stakeholder value. So there are multifarious ways we can think of that. We can always also think of, like you said earlier, before we started this conversation, thinking about the climate crisis, thinking about what kind of events produce the most carbon footprint. The answer is easily the mega sport events where it would naturally demand huge amount of jet travel from athletes and tourists attending those events, and thinking about who benefit from that process and who is harmed from that process, thinking of the people who are more vulnerable in the globe that are suffering from the consequences of human-induced climate change. I
Yeah,
could
and
go on and on.
yeah, and I haven't seen the final figures, but I think the World Cup, the 2026 World Cup in Canada, U.S., and Mexico, probably had the largest carbon footprint of any sport event in the history of the world. And that you've raised all sorts of issues that connect directly with what we've experienced in North America, especially with the World Cup. When you started listing the names of the imperialist colonial powers, you just listed the final eight. For the most part, the final eight or many of the final 16 teams in the World Cup. And interestingly, those teams from Europe were probably about 1/3 made up of players from the countries that they colonized. And Argentina is really not an exception because of the settler uh, colonialism that had occurred in Argentina. So, could you talk a little bit about how what we see in the Olympics and the World Cup is a legacy and the current uh, uh, what impact of imperialism and colonialism, the kinds of sports, the teams that are at the top, uh, and the kinds of messages that are attached to those particular mega events.
Yeah,
That's a
yeah, for sure. I would say that let's start from soccer, like you rightfully said, Jay. Thinking of the most powerful soccer nations, they certainly bear the imprint of colonialism. We can add Belgium, we can add Germany to some extent. We can and add Netherlands. The Netherlands is a
right. Belgium. Yeah.
yes. So I think thinking of the diffusion of soccer as a sport at the turn of the 20th century, it was based on the rather expensive network of colonial metropole, the colonial center, and the colonies. And we see merchants, officials set up football club, soccer club in their colonies. That's why we see in Argentina, in a lot of South American countries, there are clubs bearing English names still. There are the Argentinos juniors. There are the River Plate, so on and so forth. So I would say in other sport, I think in each individual sport we can always see a different story. And if we take a look at basketball, for example, basketball was invented in Springfield, United States, and we see the diffusion of basketball to places like the Philippines, Puerto Rico. We to other places. We see a clear sort of American imprint in those trajectories. And thinking of the the U.S. centered sort of diffusion trajectory. And in terms of Olympics is a multi-sport event. It is its own story, and we see that the sort of power struggle between the Western bloc and the socialist bloc during the Cold War, and for a lot of newly independent nation, it became a battleground to assert their national sovereignty, to express to the world that we are a independent nation. We are standing amongst the nations. in the world. And but still, we see that it is the European nation, United States, and notably China, Russia being the dominating nations in the Olympic Games. At the end of the day, we have to take a look at the economic structure that propel different countries to be able to be competitive in sport. And I will say that maybe one last point about the sort of composition of players in teams. I will say that interestingly, we see that in a lot of the core capitalist countries that has their own baggage of racial discrimination and racial violence as part of their foundation. Take United States as an example. It is built on indigenous genocide, enslavement of African people. In some ways, the excellence, the rose to prominence of racialized minorities in sports teams became a way for the state to assert, to announce that, we are a multicultural nation. We are a diverse nation that cultivates talents in all forms. It became, unfortunately, a sort of defense or even a evidence that the state can use to sort of justify its policies and it sort of launder its past. So that's the last point.
That's fantastic. And you've done a really nice job illustrating, as Jay asked you to do, the way in which sports and imperialist relations get intertwined with each other, and how they show how looking at sports shows that. I'm a little concerned though that we're getting ahead of ourselves here, which is we're assuming everybody knows what you're talking about when you say imperialism. And I find in my classes, a lot of times students don't actually know what that term means. And in fact, I would even argue, as you've already raised, a lot of times our coworkers don't know what that means. Like we all have an idea of what imperialism is, but it can be defined differently. And we also, we have to draw a distinction between, say, the Roman Imperium and 17th century imperialism of, say, Spain, and 19th, 20th into 21st century imperialism. So can you just sort of kind of give us that, like, those textbook definitions? Like, what do we mean when we're talking about imperialism? We're talking about colonialism, core, periphery, or, all these terms you're throwing around. I think it's really important for people to understand the language that you're using.
That's an excellent question and intervention, Jeff. So I would argue that to understand imperialism, we must first understand capitalism. And to me, imperialism serves as a stabilizer for capitalism, which I will explain next. If we understand capitalism as a system where the political power of a state is held by the capitalist class to serve the interests of the capitalist class, we can probably take a look at one of the core contradictions within capitalism is that capitalism demands, business people to make profit, but it also requires worker to work to produce products in order to be sold for those profit to be realized. So there is a tension between reproducing labor and realizing profit. If we consider capitalism existing in one place, we inevitably run into the situation where if I need to make money of my factory, I need to sell more stuff. In order to sell more stuff, I either need to cut cost or I need to lower the wage of my workers, or I need to, just find a cheaper place to do the manufacturing process. So maybe I can also add some technology to facilitate the production, so that it's cheaper to produce. But inevitably, you can have a scenario where the worker slash consumer is being paid less while this product that is being produced is being sold more, because workers cannot afford to buy more product in a capitalist system, let's say in one location. So gradually speaking, me as a capitalist have to think about ways, like I said earlier, to reduce cost, meaning find cheaper source of labor, finding cheaper source of raw material. I also need to find more people to buy the stuff when the domestic population may not be able to afford them in the long run. Therefore, I need to find what is called a spatial fix, meaning I need to find an overseas location where perhaps I can find cheaper raw material, where I can find cheaper labor costs, where I can find an extra a set of consumers that can buy the product I produce. But how can I do that? I need imperialism. I need my country to go there, either occupy the place or set up some policies that is favorable to me in my entire production process. So that's why I said earlier, imperialism can be understood as the stabilizer for capitalism, and therefore I define imperialism as the denial of sovereignty to a people over their territory. Imagine I set up a factory overseas. I dictate what the people over there do in terms of their time, in terms of their resources. I am denying the sovereignty of the people over there in terms of determining how the resources can be used for their own development. So, therefore, imperialism is a system where a set of core countries deny sovereignty over the peripheral countries in the process of unequal exchange. So, one question I think everybody can think of is that, for example, a dock worker in Boston, United States, is doing the same labor than a dock worker in a port city in India, but they are not compensated the same. And then we have to ask, what's going on in the process where some labor is cost cheaper or less than the same type of labor performed elsewhere? And then we have to factor in the military factor, the economic factor, the cultural and ideological factor into the scenario. Militarily, we see United States has 800 military bases across the world. Economically, we see United States sanction Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, many other places, dominating international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, so on and so forth. And culturally and ideologically, we see the operation of Hollywood, of media, including sport, that we're coming back for a moment.
So I want to bring up something here, because you've done a great job of laying out the political economic analysis. And one of the things that you're showing there is we have a set of capitalists, and they exist, in the core nations, but they also exist in the peripheral nations. But one of the things that you've pointed out is labor, just regular people like us who are paid a wage. We have to go out, get jobs. We're paid a wage. We're all being exploited. How does race come into this to create division amongst workers in different nations and even within nations? So we should all see our common interests against the capitalists and yet we tend not to. How does the operation of imperialism produce this category we call race that then breaks down solidarity amongst workers across nations?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Jeff. I will say that to go back to the metaphor I use, imperialism is a stabilizer for capitalism because imagine the sort of racial tension that existed in United States back in the mid 20th century, where uh, enslaved African people and other minorities were engaging in whether people call it civil rights movement, Black liberation movement, and demanding equal rights within United States. What did United States do at the time? United States used the Cold War and its foreign intervention in places like Indonesia to sort of release that pressure valve. And there was also the famous New Deal, that sort of like becoming the sort of pacifying factor for the tension that existed within United States. But what is the foundation of the New Deal? The foundation of the New Deal is a continuing sort of process where United States were able to extract values from its tentacles overseas and I would say transferring values from its various overseas territories and its multinational corporations back to United States. There was a pie to be divided, to be shared by the domestic population. So I think that plays an important factor to the phenomenon that you did just describe. But of course, that process is never stable. People elsewhere will stand up and fight, and that's why we see United States had to retreat from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from other places, and while finding new ways to sort of keep the commodity chain viable. And so we see that it's sort of creating this chaos and poverty and so on and so forth, climate disasters elsewhere across the globe, which in turn creates refugees that flow back into what we call the core nations. And this brings us back to the current moment where there is, of course, it's not new, but it has been the sort of policy of immigration enforcement against quote unquote illegal immigrant. But we have to ask, where do they come from? Why do they leave their home? And then we have to trace back to policies of core nations such as United States that creates those conditions back to the sending countries. And of course, while these immigrants, refugees come to United States, it creates, unfortunately, some further division between them and the domestic population, where to some extent threaten and lower the potential sort of labor militancy that existed domestically. So I would say that that's sort of like how I understand the relationship between imperialism and racial tensions. Of course, we can go on and talk about other examples.
I love that you brought up the limitations of U.S. military power, because that always just reminds me of Mao Zedong's famous speech. The United States is a paper tiger. But I want to pick up on your last point about the migration and connect that to Jay's earlier question about the final 8 teams in the World Cup, and how that those, Argentina is a little bit of an outlier, except for the fact that it's a settler colonial nation. that has very problematic racial discourse. But can you talk about how this migration, which points to the limitation of the colonial powers, but is also an illustration of the operation of imperialism, and how these colonizing nations are being enriched by the migration of specifically of athletic talent in this case?
Yeah, I would say that as a soccer fan, of course, this happens across the major soccer nations, and it is actually happened also to some newly emerging soccer nations, such as those ones in the Gulf region, in the Gulf countries, and would say that a major motivation or a deciding factor for the athletic talent from either the poorest neighborhood in Lagos, Nigeria, or to from the slums and places in Brazil, who, for example, would play for some teams in Qatar. I would say that it does reflect the sort of a global commodity chain of athletic talent, where only a few places in the world will be able to offer a relatively well-off, well-compensated working condition, and providing opportunities for the young folks from the poor neighborhood to sort of make a living. But I would say that in the back of those more high profile examples were countless stories that are not told, is that thinking about how many people of every one Romelu Lukaku, who played for Belgium, but his father is from DR Congo. Of every one Lukaku, there might be 99 young people from DR Congo who may never reach the level that Lukaku does. And we have to then ask the question of what happened to them and what is going on within these former colonies, now independent nations, whose economy is still dependent upon the world economy that is dominated by Western capitalist interests, and what kind of forces are in place to make sure that there are ample economic opportunities for the local folks to be able to build their own life. So I would say that I see the phenomenon of athletic migration actually raise this larger question of underdevelopment of the sending nations, where folks should not only focus on the high profile success stories, but really asking question of what are the conditions that are in place that prevents the talent to stay in their own country.
So, Chen, I wanted to move in a slightly different direction, kind of an ironic direction in a way, because many of the wealthier countries from the global north that you have discussed in terms of the way that they have increased their wealth uh, are developing programs, sport for development programs, and they take those programs to these under-resourced nations, and and they sell them, and they sell the fund. They get funding for them on this premise that if we bring sport to these nations, they're going to be able to use it to experience upward mobility, community development, and change their culture in ways that are more consistent with development. So, so that is one way to look at sport for development. Now, there's other ways to look at sport for development, and that is from the perspectives of those under-resourced countries and communities to begin with, and use and have them use sport on their own terms to develop in the ways that they want to develop. And I'm wondering, is there a future for sport for development, or is it destined to be used to sustain this whole kind of colonial process?
I appreciate the question. The question will not be necessarily appreciated by sport for development funders, but I think that's an important one. And to me, I believe that, the key question is what will enable sport for development to exist? The answer is perpetual underdevelopment. Perpetual underdevelopment will enable sport for development to exist. And this is a separate question than the intention, individual sort of aspiration from people who work in sport for development. We need to situate sport for development within the larger constellation of Western-led, global North funded development industrial complex. We see USAID, United States Agency for International Development. It's done overseas, as an arm of U.S. soft power, and we can take a look at the sport for development countries or programs locations, and thinking about what are the political situation that enable the perpetual underdevelopment that would warrant the intervention of the goodwill, kind-hearted sport for development practitioners to come in to be a savior. There is not enough reflection. There's not enough self-reflection that will be sufficient to undo the sort of structural deficiency or, the place of these under-resourced nations within the imperialist world economy. This goes back to my earlier sort of definition of imperialism. Imperialism serves to deny sovereignty of people in underdeveloped, under-resourced nations until people in those nations have the wherewithal to make decisions as far as how resources of this land, people in this country, can be organized, governed to build the country according to the will of its people. Sport for development will at best serve as essential service provider. Not to say it's not valuable in providing goods and services that communities might need, but it will never tackle the structural issue that creates underdevelopment in the first place.
But could it? That's a question that a lot of people will ask who are looking at sport for development as a context within which certain forms of resistance can occur, and where development can occur on the terms of the people in that under-resourced country. Is that possible? And what I know they're going to run into all sorts of problems in doing that, but is it worth pursuing that line or that way of doing sport for development?
Yeah, I would say that I would not dispute that it has some potential. I think the question that to your question is who is asking this question?
Okay.
Is this a member of a Western NGO? Is it a volunteer at a specific program? There are different ways. There are different people in the sort of the structure of the sport for development industrial complex can assert their agency. So of course there is potential for valuable work in even resistance to be done, but I would say that how it will look like for a funder, a class treater, a funder, let's call it a class treater, or a manager or a volunteer on the ground will probably look different. So I also think that some of the conversation will necessarily not have to happen, in public. If
So
people want
we're
to
starting to run close
do
to our
something
hour,
valuable,
and
local
I would be
community,
really remiss if I did
don't
not ask
don't
you
broadcast it.
about your
Don't
activism,
don't include it
specifically
into your
the Sports Scholars
report
for
in the first
Justice
place.
in Palestine. Can you talk about that work that you're doing there? Because I think what's going on in Palestine right now is one of the great political, moral, and humanitarian questions that we have to address. And I think part of where my question's coming from, and this is, I don't know, this you had asked me on an email a couple of years ago when I was through the North American Society of Sociology of Sport. You said to me, because I was chairing the political advocacy committee, you said, Jeff, I think it would be really great if NAS put out a statement about Palestine. And my initial response is, I was like, well, I don't know, Chen. I mean, I don't see the sport part of this. And we're a professional sport organization, scholarly sport organization. Um, and you have since then thoroughly proved me wrong about that. And we did put out a statement eventually, but can you help talk us through this, like the work that you're doing, why sports scholars, why people just that care about sport should be involved in this?
Yeah, for sure. I will say that for me personally, understanding the issue that concerns the ongoing genocide in Palestine was sort of a natural extension from my previous work. So if I said, I am a scholar that interested in colonialism and imperialism, this is something that me personally cannot skip. I have to confront it. And of course, it also involved a process of serious study of the history and the contemporary context of Palestine. And I will say that October 7th and the sort of happenings thereafter in the last almost 3 years, it opens up an opportunity for more people who otherwise may not be necessarily familiar with the Israel-Palestine situation to be more sort of informed and understand it better. And I will say that it's pretty apparent when one starts to look at the situation in Palestine in terms of the involvement of sport in that context. We can think about the sort of restrictions, barriers where Palestinians have to go through checkpoints in order to move across their own territory at the behest of the Israeli army and so on and so forth. We can take a look at the more than 800, almost 1,000 athletes that have been massacred since October 7, 2023. We can always also look at the sort of maiming and disablement of Palestinian athletes, those who survived the bombing and the killing spree. And we can also take a look at, for example, the sort of ways that the state of Israel has been trying to utilize sport as a way to showcase and its national identity and to assert itself within the international community as a nation when it's facing sort of a legitimacy crisis from the get-go, and especially from the 70s when it was expelled from some of the sport governing bodies in Asia. And we can always also look at the sort of racial politics within the state of Israel in their sports teams, in their fan base, their racist sort of sentiment towards the Arabs and Palestinian athletes and communities. We can also look at, for example, the sort of football club, soccer club that are operating in the West Bank as a form of a violation of international law. Israeli football clubs, there are about a dozen of them operating and hosting games in the occupied West Bank. That is a contravention of international law. It's a violation of FIFA's own statute, and that's why we filed a legal complaint to the International Criminal Court in February 2026, and trying to hold Infantino and president of UEFA Chefrin accountable for their sort of acquiescence of those illegal activities of Israeli Football Association and clubs. So I would say that of course, going back to your earlier question, thinking about the realities faced by the Palestinian people, Palestinian athletes, their sort of way of using sport to assert their national identity as a way of saying we are still here. It just compels me to, as somebody who is relatively secure and privileged in my position, to try to advocate. So that's why we set up the platform of Sports Scholars for Justice in Palestine as a way to encourage scholars, students, and athletes to come together and have a place to have critical conversations internally, but also advocate for the Palestinian cause externally. And as everybody can tell, it's still a uphill fight in terms of like gaining the sort of momentum that the Palestinian athletes deserve. And I think it's just a responsibility for us justice-minded people to do this work. And of course, this work will not necessarily be well received or welcome in everywhere. But I would say that I think for people who have come to understand and study this issue, once you go onto the journey, there's very few things that can turn you back. There will be risks involved in this work, but I would say that it's a risk worth taking. And I would say encourage more people to engage in this work and understand that what happens in Palestine never stops in Palestine. And those AI-powered drone attacks are coming back to the United States to roost. And when it comes to surveil the domestic population, when it comes to technologies encroaching our education institutions, and so on and so forth.
So I appreciate you saying that there are risks. You know, when we did put out that statement for the NAS statement in support of Palestinians, despite the fact that I am Jewish and I am indigenous, I got accused of being anti-Semitic for that statement. But I think that, you know, one of the things we know is a lot of college-aged people in core imperialist nations have become incredibly sympathetic to the Palestinians, have become increasingly critical of Israeli aggression and the genocide. What are meaningful ways that students that care about this in imperial core nations can get involved and can support Palestinians? I mean, are there meaningful ways for people in imperial core nations to be on the side of colonized people? I guess is what I'm asking you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would say there are plentiful of examples of young people in the colonizing nations stand in solidarity in a spirit of internationalism from below to stand with the colonized people. We think of Rachel Corrie, we think of Muhammad Ali, we think of Pat Tillman, we think of other athletes who were able to during the Vietnam War, during the invasion of Iraq, and stand up and speak out. As far as I would say, generally the young folks in the imperialist core, one thing that came to my mind is the encampment of college students that spread across North American universities and colleges and beyond. Actually, they served as a catalyst for a larger sort of movement at the time in the spring of 2024. It is the students, the young people who put their body on the line that inspired a lot of faculty members, older people, more secure people to take risks. So I have immense respect to those student activists, including those on my own campus. And I will say that, going back to the sort of examples, going back to Vietnam War, it was students who were able to, again, put their body on the line and creates the sort of barriers for the state to sort of launder and whitewash their actions and deeds abroad. So I would say that young people are they're catching up on what's going on, and this generation of young people also face a host of other sort of issues that previous generation have not faced, including the encroachment of social media, the proliferation and ever increasing power of technology oligopolies in this country that are threatening the very sort of like sociality of communities, and for people to even just build relationship with another person. So I actually will start with stay present and be able to build relationship with another person is actually a highly valuable, underappreciated, but difficult task nowadays. And we need that in order to be able to build a movement. As far as the anti-imperialist side, always add pressure to your lawmakers, to your elected officials, pressuring them, demanding them to withhold the next bill that will send money to Israel, or to increase the budget for the Defense Department of the United States, and thinking about how those money could have been spent to build your school, your hospital, your library, so on and so forth. So there are various ways for young people to get involved, thinking of the electoral victories that has happened in different locations in the United States, led by democratic socialists and so on and so forth. And I think the fight has just begun, and we also see the intensified crackdown and proclaimed sort of attack by the administration, by the state. And I think we need more people to stay together and join the fight.
That is such a great way to wrap up this discussion, to focus on the costs of this imperial ambition. So we're in the imperial core, and you're a college student. You were the most privileged. You were amongst the most, to use that what's become a liberal term, privileged people in the world. And yet, most of our students are taking out tremendous debt to fund not just their education, but their jobs training, right? This college education is jobs training. So you are taking out a tremendous amount of debt. Somebody's collecting rent on your jobs training. And yet most of our students are also working 20 or more hours per week so they can get that certificate so that they can then go out into a gig economy in a world that's burning. The contradictions, I think, have never been more obvious to college students than right now. And the pain they're experiencing speaks to what you just said about the success of DSA and other socialist identified candidates. This is really, really powerful, but we do have to end it here. We're over our time. We have so much more we could talk about. Thank you, Chen, for this fantastic conversation that we've had today. For folks listening, please keep an eye out for our next exciting topical episode of Sports and Society. In fact, I think our next episode might be on, what's that term? Ethical consumption and consumer activism within sports. One of Chen's friends, Rok Rashan, is coming on to help us discuss that. You can always join our conversation on the Discord server. There's an invite link in the description to this episode. Thank you so much, Chen.
Yeah, thank you, Chen.
My pleasure.